we have some questions coming in, and we had a question that I wrote an answer to, but I'd like to get others' answer, and that's not dual programming at the end, but dual data entry as people enter data into the EDC. Josh and Lindsay, and then Chris, maybe you want to comment on what DCRI's doing with that issue.
Sure. In terms of double data entry, that I feel is most useful depending on what is the context of the data collection. If you're collecting data from paper case report forms, double data entry was meant to kind of flag when, typos or other errors happened at the point of entering things from a paper case report form into the EDC, into a database. But if you're doing electronic data capture, that has a lot more safeguards and data quality assurance built into the data collection mechanism that don't come with a paper case report form. Like if somebody skips a page on a paper case report form, the only way to catch that is an astute coordinator who's really on the ball in terms of making sure that all of the data has been entered, that data is legible, and that there's also the issue of if you have two people entering a data from a case report form, is that a 7? Is that a 1? Two different, there's also variation between people and interpretations of handwriting and things like that. So I would say that the choice of an appropriate data quality assurance and data quality control plan depends on, not just what you're collecting, but how you're collecting it.
Okay, Lindsay, do you want to add anything?
Only to add that it was used in the past before the EDC when we had all of those safeguards and all our quality control reports that we do nowadays. That was the norm then. But now with the EDC, it's very sophisticated. We can add a lot of safeguards of saying, oh, this date, it needs to be from this year to this year. You can put and program a lot of those, and anything that is not that is missed by the EDC about entering incorrect or weird data, it's catched when we run reports and you're looking at the data and you're looking for outliers and correct it that way. So for me, dual programming is no longer necessary, especially because we have all of these sophisticated programs to be able to target that what was used for. So
okay, Chris.
Yeah, I appreciate what everyone has said, and I will use two words: risk-based. The error rate of double entry is approximately 0.5%. So that's 5 errors out of every 1,000 keystrokes. That's not very big. The reduction in that error rate from single data entry to double data entry is to about 0.25%, maybe as low as 0.1%. So the amount of data correction or the data fixing is actually quite small. The question I have is, what do you double data enter? Do you double data enter every single thing? Or do you double check every single outcome and every single eligibility criteria? So we really need to apply these questions not as a broad stroke, but in terms of a risk-based perspective. As an example, Josh, I'm going to pick on your, well, as data come in from the EHR, there's all these things that make sure it's the right stuff. Some coder somewhere took blood pressure and interpreted that and created a transform that extracted something from a field in the EHR, put it into a data set and gave it to us. We have actually not really much evidence that that pathway was correct. I'll go a step further. The data entered into the EHR in the first place, they weren't double entered and they're frequently wrong. I will give you one example. I was doing a research study with a OBGYN resident back when I was in Cincinnati. And the study was about pap smears. And so she did a chart review and pulled a bunch of data. And I was looking at it and I realized there was a guy in the data set. I thought, this doesn't look right. This is coded as male. And yet this is about pap smears. And so I asked her to go back and pull me the chart. It was my medical record. And what had happened is my provider had documented my wife's pap smear in my medical record. And that had made it into a chart review abstract or an EHR data extract. And so if that was an outcome in a trial, I would have wanted to know that. But if it was some little covariate hiding in the background that I didn't really care about, I actually wouldn't have worried too much. So go
Yeah,
back to the source and understand the source and make sure that the risk of that source getting to truth is minimized.
Yeah, perhaps I misspoke. I meant to say EDC if I did say EHR. So when we're entering things into the EDC, but you're absolutely right, is that in terms of EHR stuff, as somebody who has worked considerably with EHR, you see some, pretty interesting things that happen in those systems. But in terms of like, with the EDC, there's actually, range checks. So if, for example, a BMI of, 1,000, 68, that will get flagged as like, this is not compatible with human physiology. This does not make sense.
Yeah,
Right.
I fully agree. The challenge is as we are trying to get more and more efficient, our EDCs are linked directly to the EHR using FHIR endpoints, and we're able to extract data automatically. And everybody assumes that that solves the double data entry, single data entry problem. But the automated data extract struggles with exactly the same issues.
Okay. We have two more AI questions. Can you share an example of how AI driven, I think, solutions are used for validating the data sets and how it's done? I think we've heard some interesting anecdotes of where there may be error. Um, are there any positive stories here?
Uh,
Go
I can
ahead.
share a simple example.
Yeah.
So we were running a study. It was a very large decentralized trial. And somebody asked us to do some ongoing statistical monitoring. And so as the data are accruing, just looking for patterns in the data that would be a little bit unusual. And AI was incredibly helpful in identifying some data patterns that identified a site that was an outlier. And that site was an outlier because it had a pattern related to its outcomes, its eligibility criteria, and the timing at which data were entered. We would never have found that by human look, but the AI found it. The good news is that site taught us something because they had actually executed our protocol with such fidelity that their data had so little variation in it. And that was what we'd identified. So it was a good thing. AI found us a pattern. We acted on the pattern, and then the pattern told us how we could do other sites better.
That's a nice example. Did AI find the humans who were um, re-entering themselves into one of the COVID trials when they didn't get randomized to the right arm from their perspective?
That would have been a very good use of pattern matching. Unfortunately, if it's I know so some of those trials just didn't have the resources or the software to be able to do the proper human authentication at the point of entry. That could become a really good thing for AI to help solve.
So in the case of your experience, it was actually humans who did find that problem.
Yes, the good old monitoring works. We're pretty good at finding patterns.
One of the themes is humans plus AI make things better, and they make each other better. Is that a reasonable statement?
Say again, I was reading the question in the chat box because I was about to explain.
Yeah, humans plus AI makes things better.
I think that is the vision and the hope.
Yeah.
So my belief is that it can. Whether it will depends on us.
Okay. Now the last question that we have right now that you were reading and I interrupted you. We didn't quite understand what Chris meant when he said that AI can read code and accurately annotate. Annotate to what exactly?
So if we think about the origination of large language models, they're translators. One of the best things they are at in the world is going from one language to another. If we think about what code is, doesn't matter whether it's software code or stat code, it's a language. It's a way of communication. And so large language models are really very, very good at taking a statistician's unannotated, undocumented gross code and converting it into very, very simple lay language that somebody else can then use to decipher and debug. And so these are the kinds of ways, if we understand how the tools are developed, we can really leverage them strongly. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, if it didn't, maybe we'll we'll see a redirect. So I have a question for Andrew and Guyan. If each of you had one thing to emphasize on the ending phases of a trial, what would you emphasize? Guyan, you nodded your head, so you get to go first.
Sure. I'm still trying to think what is one thing to emphasize, but basically, I think it's basically that the manuscript production, the whole system, right, has to be in place. I think that's what I would emphasize, is that we hopefully we collected good data, we tested the processes, we understood who's involved in what, who is going to take the responsibility for the authorship, and then how it's going to be presented. So I think, again, maybe it's my bias as a statistician, so I like that whole thinking about that whole workflow and way before we're ending the trial.
So if I restate, if a good manuscript production process is in place,
Robust process
robust,
in place.
yeah, then the important little questions will fall into place and be given the priority and importance that they need to be given.
And hopefully some of the things are discussed in advance again, because like Andrew said, there are some emotions that are flying that need to be managed, and pre-planning would help with that.
Okay, so Andrew, by going second, you can't say Guyan gave the answer. What else?
Yeah, of course not. No, I think, my emphasis would be at that stage, you shouldn't be reactionary. There should be no surprises, right? So if you've done everything right, at that stage, it takes care of itself. And if you're not finding yourself in that situation, it's probably due to that lack of planning and forethought in all of the systems that my, co-presenters walked you through. So in a sense, my parting sort of focus would be on sticking to the plan, right? Because that plan should be there and all you have to do is execute it. And when you start deviating from what you've sort of thought through for years, that's when you're going to start to struggle, and things are going to take longer and be more burdensome.
So deviations are usually rabbit holes.
Yeah.
To try to avoid, or to ask, why is this deviation so important that we need to alter our plan?
Yeah, well said.
Okay.
Can I add a couple of comments here, Dan?
Yeah, please. And
Yeah,
then,
so
you're
Guyani,
gonna have to answer another question, Chris.
Yeah, so Guyani, I think you're the manuscript itself, and I love that it was like write the manuscript before the analysis. I actually think you write them in the manuscript before you enroll patients, and then you optimize. You optimize, because ultimately that manuscript is going to be the answer to the question that you asked.
Right.
Now, outside of that, Andrew, I think what you were commenting on at the end, which is the depositing the data. And I think that the most critical thing that we can do as researchers is not just give a simple answer to the question that we asked without subjectivity and stupidity, but is put valid data out into the world so other people can continue to ask and answer important questions. So I actually think we have to start with two things in mind: the manuscript written down and the data repository that data are going to, with whatever data standards and approaches you want to use to get there. Those two things, we optimize, I think, our impact on the world.
Yeah, agree.
I think those are wonderful comments. Now you got the question directed to you, Chris. What, with data security in mind, does sharing code with an AI system for reading and analysis have any impact? What are the risks and safeguards we should consider?
Yeah, so there's a few things in here, and we are going through kind of some of these conversations locally. One example would be, let's say you have some R code that extracts data from REDCap and writes a summary report, and you put that into ChatGPT to give you a summary. And you forgot that the first line of the code was your API token, which is actually your username and password. That would be a really bad thing to do and very silly. If you had code that was contracted to be confidential, keeping that behind closed doors is critical. But a code snippet that goes into the cloud and says, you know, what does this mean, is probably okay. Now, there are going to be real challenges. If you have a complex set of code which is actually moving the needle on methodology and it's intellectual property or novel software, then you might actually be going too far by putting that into the public domain. And so, you know, my response to the question is, understand what it is that you're putting in. Are you putting in something generic that is not confidential and therefore nobody cares? Or are you putting stuff that is confidential, that might contain PHI, that might contain usernames or passwords, in which case you should care deeply and the institution should care deeply. And of course, all around this, many people think that they own the documents that are being submitted, and make sure you understand who truly does.
Okay. Understand what you're putting in, look at the contractual provenance, and understand who owns the code.
Yeah.
Okay. Jeff Burke, I have two questions about gamification that was briefly mentioned, and happy to take response offline if it's outside the scope. I don't think it is. How do you structure the recruit gamification so it's fair between differentially motivated populations with different amounts of effort for responses between sites? And do you have a process to prevent sites from taking shortcuts to increase their numbers as it applies to gamification? Before we get answers here, I will say there's a whole white paper on gamification that has some of these answers in the TIN toolbox. A lot of the things that got talked about today have processes in the TIN toolbox. Who would like to start with the gamification answer?
I can start it.
Okay.
So first, I know that all of you are going to receive our slides. So there's a reference paper of a manuscript that we wrote about gamification. It does answer some of the questions, but one of the things that we do is we use the EDC to be able to collect a lot of the data and to, build in sort of the rules of the game for all of our sites for our trials. And we do take into account so what does that site enrollment goals are. So we do allow for that and we build that into the game. So I think that answers your question about how do you build that in? And honestly, for us, if we have a big site that had committed to enrolling, let's say 50 patients versus another one that had only enrolled, only committed to maybe 10 patients, that's not a fair comparison. So the game at the very beginning, what I mentioned about startup, that doesn't take into account it's randomizations. But so we have one game for the beginning of the trial. The randomization game, we can build that in and to differentiate between the enrollment targets per site. And then we build in screening numbers, other things that they can do to be able to gain points so that it's not driven by it doesn't emphasize the difference between the two sites. Does anybody else want to add to building the game?
Yeah, I would just add that the focal point of the game is centered around the very same paradigm of what matters in the clinical trial. Finding patients, recruiting patients, keeping patients in, and getting the data, right? So they're no better off in gaming the system for points there than they are in gaming the clinical trial overall, right? So if they are erroneously entering screens to increase that number, that's where careful review of the screening logs and understanding the validity of that for somebody to have 100 screens that historically only had 10 becomes readily apparent. So I think the game itself is so closely aligned with the goals of the trial that artificially creating that signal is sort of inherently covered in the paradigm of the trial structure in the game.
Right. So paraphrasing, it's not just about the recruitment numbers, and building your game to optimize the whole trial operation. And you named a bunch of different parts of it. I'd include doing the intervention right. You could have great recruitment, no missing data, but the intervention isn't done according to protocol, and you got trouble. So build the game broadly, right?
And the other thing that we do is we adjust the game when, so the game could be running for a period of time for all of the enrollment. We might be able to build the game within the game when we are foreseeing very like laws in the game. Like we know that there's going to be, the holidays for some of our trials are, times when recruitment it's lower just because a lot of staff go out and so that we build the game to earn extra points during that time so that they're gaining points and we do increase our enrollment because we know and we can anticipate that enrollment numbers are going to go down in that particular month or that particular time period. So giving incentives to if you do it here, we'll give you more points also helps troubleshoot those issues that we happen to see in clinical trials.
Great. And thank you, Lindsay. I think those are good points. And Cecilia and Yong Jin, who gets the Tin Booster Award for this meeting, have put in data sources where you can find the gamification toolbox and some of the publications. They're in the chat for you. Here we go. One last question. Diane, Chris, and Josh, I'd appreciate it if you could share examples of best practices for communicating statistical language and concepts to non-statisticians across functional teams during trial operations. For instance, when defining endpoints, preparing DSMB reports, or conducting other data-related tasks. So statistics for non-statistical operational people, how to communicate.
So I'm going to go back to something I said in terms of what large language models are really good at. It's translation. And I will often sit in a meeting with a statistician and a clinical trialist who just don't understand or are fighting. And we'll say, you know what, let's stop this fighting. Let's pull up ChatGPT and just start asking questions. And it changes the dynamic completely. And it allows the statistician to communicate with the clinician in ways that the clinician understands. And you can do very clever things, like, say, using principles from the specialty of otolaryngology. Please describe what a p-value means. And it will come back and say, the threshold for surgery was a biomarker greater than this, but the patient was just below the threshold, but you thought they really needed to have surgery. Was that binary cut point a good thing? And that kind of a use of ChatGPT and our translators, I find incredibly effective. I don't know if it's a best practice. And I know that it has generated some bad things and I've had to correct it, and we've had some fun around it. It's been team building, but it's translation. And that's what I think is key.
Okay. Diane, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, and Chris is right. Sometimes there are really some weird situations where we each are entrenched in our own world and it's sort of very hard to go across. But I think, well, I guess my situation is slightly different. One, I have some medical background. Two, in the consulting center, that's essentially what we do, right? We essentially help work these through with so many different departments, diseases, conditions. So it sort of comes with the territory. So we kind of learn to do this and hopefully do it well, but essentially be able to speak at the language, kind of translate what this really means. And the example, I think, in the question was picking the outcome, thinking about what outcome we're likely to affect is the example I gave in my presentation. Which outcome is more variable? Which outcome is more likely to have more missing data? Which outcome is important to the sponsor, right? So if it's, again, depending on where we are in that trial continuum, which one would be important to demonstrate. But again, this is a learned skill. We actually have a colleague of ours is teaching a course on statistical consulting. And I think lots of that is those, how do we communicate? How we forget the jargon and kind of really communicate at the level that the team can understand. Again, learned skill, it just kind of still working on it as a progress, but some of it is what we do in day to day. So I'll let Josh take it from here.
Yeah, it's like Eddie said, it's a learned skill. You win some, you lose some. And what I will say, speaking from the perspective of a statistician who has to translate to clinicians, I find it useful to, whenever I find an analogy that hits home, write it down, keep a log of all these things, because again, like being able to pull up those analogies and things like that makes a world of difference in collaboration. And when you come up with a good one, you win some, you lose some. Whenever you put points on the board, you better remember what plays you made to get those points there. So I will say, like, if you are a statistician and you are dealing with a clinical or common audience, remember who you're talking to. Remember what the shared goal is. And when you do come up with those things that connect, like, put those in your pocket and save those for another day, because I guarantee you they will come up again.
So communication requires some repetition, requires analogy for non-numerical people. And I think the final thing is accept sometimes that there are differences and come back to that issue in the next step, whether it's repeating the meeting in a week. That can be helpful. Not giving ground on an important issue that puts at risk the basis for the trial is critical in those kinds of differences of opinion. Diane has written a book, which she makes me read in every meeting, called Statistics for Dummies. And us non-statistical people are gradually learning from that book. I think we're at 5:04. New questions haven't appeared. So I want to thank our speakers and our panelists for a really good discussion. And I hope this was meaningful to all of the participants. I want to thank you for joining us,